Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatoria, and I'm making a video here which is partly dedicated to Harrison Hohenweg. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. He's a HEMA practitioner based out of Melbourne in Australia, and so he posted a question up about essentially, what is this? Yes, haha, it's a sword, it's a saber, but what is this specifically, this thing I'm pointing at, that leather disc down there? Now, many of you will have noticed these on antique sabers or even other types of sword potentially, and many of the people watching my videos indeed might have noticed these on many of my antique sabers. Not all of them, but I'll talk about that in a second. And the simple answer, to answer the question straight at the beginning, but then go deeper into it for some more deep penetration on this topic, that is a washer. Okay, surprise, surprise, no great kind of revelation there. That thing is called a washer. I have never really seen it referred to as anything else. If it's got any other technical names, I'm not aware of it. But the more interesting question is, why is it there? What does it do? Is it possible to not have one? And does it always do the same thing on different swords? Well, I'll kind of give a bit of an answer to that straight up. There are a couple of reasons why that's there. And no, they don't always, washers that are there don't always do the same thing. I'm going to talk a bit more about this. For any of you who are thinking, oh no, not more sabers, this will go a little bit into swords which aren't sabers as well, if you bear with me. So first up, what does the leather washer do in this case, or in the case of British military sabers, or we could say just in the case of European military sabers, because it's not only found on British swords, but you also find it on French and Prussian and Spanish and Italian and other swords. Okay, now these don't appear on most swords until you get to about, let's say, the 17th century. They start to appear. Why do they start to appear then? I mean, I'm not going to say even that you don't find similar things, such as these leather washers appearing earlier. You kind of do. You get forms of leather chape and things like this, which we could say are kind of related in some way. But why do we find them appearing in the 17th century? Well, my answer would be that predominantly we start to see forms of shell and basket hilt and bowl hilt start to become pretty much the norm in the 17th century. And I suspect that because of the kind of larger, heavier guards that you start to get on swords at that time, or at least that had become common on swords by that time, because really those things started to appear really in the 16th century. I suspect that by that point they'd found that often these guards got loose and rattly, and so one way of preventing that is when you peen the whole hilt assembly. Peening, for anybody who doesn't know, is essentially riveting the end of the tang, so the tang, or a stalk of iron that's forge welded onto the steel blade. It's not the same piece of metal, incidentally, for those of you who don't know. A piece of iron tang welded to a steel blade. That stalk comes through the hilt construction to the end and is then squished, essentially, or riveted, peened at the end, and that tightens up the whole hilt assembly. But in use, and it can just be, not even just hitting against things, but it can be through expansion and contraction of the wooden grip here, sometimes the hilt gets loose. And the bigger, longer, wider, the more leverage you can get on a hilt, the more likely that hilt, the guard rather, is likely to become loose. So anybody who does rapier, for example, with a cup hilt rapier, you go to any rapier competition and you'll hear a lot of rattling, and the rattling is coming from the cup hilt rapiers because they get loose. Similarly, if you do basket hilted broadsword or backsword or saber, same thing again. We often end up with loose hilts, and it's annoying. Not only is the loose hilt annoying, but it also robs energy from the strike, potentially, okay, and can make a sword less efficient and potentially kind of slightly disconcerting to use. So anybody would prefer to have a tight hilt. Now, one way of doing that is if you insert a leather washer between the shoulder of the blade where it comes into the tang, you put a leather washer up there, and then you peen all of the hilt tight. It enables you to get quite a sort of compressed hilt assembly that also has some shock absorbency to it. I'm just going to put this saber down and grab another one. And so this is the famous 1796 light cavalry sabre, which, little plug, I'm going to be putting some versions of this up for sale on my Eastern Antique Arms website, link below, quite soon. Now this sword does indeed have a leather washer. If we just come in here and try and get it to focus on the sword rather than my face, there we go, it has a leather washer in there. Now, one disadvantage of these leather washers is leather deteriorates more readily than wood and iron and brass and things like this. So unfortunately, and in fact they're not always leather, even on French swords for example, or certain small swords, you sometimes find that the washer is not even leather. Sometimes it's a type of fabric like velvet or something like this, and unfortunately they do perish with age. Now I'm sure that during the service life of those swords this wasn't necessarily a problem, because if you're carrying a sword for 10 years, then the felt or the leather might not deteriorate in 10 years. But this sword is 200 years old, so after 200 years, yeah, quite often the leather will deteriorate. And unfortunately, one of the reasons for that is oil. And oil is great for preserving steel, really bad at leather. Okay, it tends to promote the decomposition and destruction of leather, unfortunately. So unfortunately, in looking after the steel of the sword, often it deteriorates the washer. So the end result is that unfortunately the very thing which was designed to make the hilt assembly tight and solid often results in the hilt assembly becoming loose, because if the leather washer goes or deteriorates or shrinks with age or just falls away, then unfortunately the whole hilt assembly can come loose, and then you've got a problem of having to tighten the hilt up again. Now this was noticed in period. And so one solution to it, well there's two solutions, one was to replace a leather washer with something else, like something metal, could be a softer metal like brass, but in British swords very often it was a steel washer. Now then it starts to come into the realms of being for a different purpose, doesn't it? So if we look at this sword, this is a 1845 pattern British infantry officer sword. It happens to be a full width tang patent hilt, but that's beside the point. And if we look, you can see what here is a buff leather, so not normal tanned leather, but buff leather washer. But underneath it, and I don't know if you'll be able to see this on camera, I'll try and make it focus on the sword. Underneath, you'll be able to see a dark brown coloured another washer, and that is steel. Okay, now some of these swords have a steel washer with no leather over the top. This has both. Now at this point I'll hasten to point something out. That leather washer is no longer there for the compression of the hilt assembly. Okay, the reason I know that is because it's not under the shoulders of the tang. So if we look at the 1796, for example, the leather washer in this case sits underneath the shoulders of the blade at the meeting of the tang. So that is held in by compression. If I grab the first sword that I was holding, this leather washer is not sat underneath the edges of the blade. It's simply slid down the blade and probably tacked with a little bit of glue in place there. So why might we have a leather washer which doesn't seat between the edges of the blade and the top of the guard? Well, quite simply, it's for a different purpose. Okay, in this case, it's a seal, so it's still a washer, but it is a way of keeping damp out of your scabbard, because you've now by this point got a steel scabbard. And they found that if you have a nice leather washer in there, it prevents rain and damp from getting down between the guard and the scabbard, getting inside the scabbard, ruining the blade, potentially ruining the scabbard, and perhaps you could argue even more importantly, if you're suddenly in a combat situation and you go to draw your sword out, oh shit, it's rusted in there. Okay, and I know of one specific account, in fact with a wooden scabbard, of this happening in combat where someone was attacked, they needed to defend themselves, they went to pull the sword out, damp had got in there and literally rusted the sword into the scabbard. Okay, so good reason to keep an oily blade, folks, because then even if rust gets into the scabbard, it won't adhere really to the blade. So that leather washer has a different purpose on this sword, despite the fact you might think, oh, leather washers, both British military swords, yep, true, but different purpose. Although it must be said, the leather washer, as well as making the hilt assembly tighter on the 1796, will also have the dual function of creating a seal with the scabbard. However, in the Victorian sword's case, in this Victorian sword's case, that leather washer is only there to provide a seal. Okay, now coming back to this sword, what they've done here, that's why it's got two washers. The steel washer is there for one purpose, and I'll come through to that in a minute, and the leather washer is purely there to form a seal with the scabbard, which unfortunately in the case of this sword I do not any longer, well, I've never had. I was going to say I don't any longer have. What have I done with it? No, I just never, this sword never had its scabbard with it, unfortunately. In modern times anyway, obviously originally it had a scabbard. So we've got two different washers. A leather washer as a seal, not as a compression, and a steel washer. Now why is the steel washer there? You can see why. This is a whole video, okay? This is not a simple topic and there's not a simple answer. So those are fulfilling different functions. In this case, the steel washer, you couldn't really say it's there to form a compression but in the hilt assembly, because you can't compress the steel. In fact, literally in the case of this sword, the guard is softer than the washer that's there underneath. We have a steel washer and a brass guard. So the brass itself will compress to some degree, and it will form in fact this is a nut at the end, so there's a nut inside as well, so these have an internal nut and an external nut. So this is made into a really tight assembly, and in fact this being a full width patent tang, or solid patent hilt as they're called, you don't really have a problem of loosening, because it's held together by being screwed on rather than being peened. So why is that steel washer there? Well, quite simply, it's there to protect the guard. So what we do now is we go to the 1864 pattern Gymnasium sabers. Now for anybody who's looked at any of the Eastern sabers that I've designed with various companies over the years, and I'm working on a new one at the moment with another company, which hopefully this autumn, or fall for Americans, will hopefully be available. But anybody who's seen the sabers that I have developed are modelled on this 1864 pattern Gymnasium saber with a hollow dumbbell section blade with nice thick edges and very nice things. They're the same weight and balance as an actual service sword, around 800 to 850 grams, same size. Now you will notice that there is no washer at all here, and that was a problem with these. Okay, so I have about 6 of these in my collection, and half of them have clearly been used quite a bit, like this one, and are breaking through the guard here. So I'll again try and get it to focus on the sword and not my face. So hopefully you can see that down here the edges of the hole in which the tang goes through are breaking away and are almost shearing. Okay, now I've actually had this, unfortunately I didn't keep it, I threw it away because it was broken, but I've actually had this happen to one of my own modern made practice sabers, where literally the hard steel of the blade, those shoulders where it meets the tang, through repeated use of hitting and guarding and all this kind of stuff, whether it's drilling or sparring, there's a tiny amount of movement between the hard steel of the blade and the soft steel or iron of the guard, and essentially the blade eats the guard. That's right, blades eat guards, and it literally worked its way through the sheet steel of the guard to a point where suddenly the guard went pop, and you've no longer got the guard sitting on the kind of shelf of the edge of the blade. It just goes away and pop, and you end up with the guard having nothing to sit against because the hole is made larger by the blade. So quite simply, they needed to put a reinforcement on there, okay? And that, my friends, is what the steel disc is for on these swords. So we've got a steel washer as a reinforcement to the soft brass guard, so that the blade doesn't eat through the brass, and then you've got a leather washer to perform the function of being a seal, a bit like a rubber washer on plumbing, with the scabbard. Okay, so those are those things. Now we come to one of my newer acquisitions, which, oh, and before I move on to that, just to show the Coveton Gymnasium sabre, you'll notice that they, before I even started talking to them, had already put a reinforcing thing on there, because many people in the modern world using these had discovered, just like in the olden days, that the blades eat through the guards. That's mild steel, that's hardened carbon steel, so you need to put a steel washer in there to protect the guard from the blade, okay? Otherwise it will just eat its way through. So coming on to a new acquisition of mine, which is going to be cleaned up and restored, I think probably on video. This is an 1895 pattern Gymnasium sabre, British military, but it's a copy of the Masiello sabre, okay? And you'll notice it's got a very narrow blade, but it's got a large hilt, and the overall weight, may surprise you, may not, I don't know, is the same as the earlier 1864 sabre. But you can see that the proportions are very different. The blade being narrower hits with a lot less force, ergo you can wear less protection or pick up less injuries, okay, or both. So it's a narrow, flexible blade with a sort of dumbbell end, nice and blunt. I can comfortably do that into my hand. These became regulation in the British Army in 1895 and accompanied Masiello's new infantry sword exercise of 1895, which replaced what went before. Hutton didn't like these. Hutton didn't like the manual. That's, I talked about in previous videos, but that's also for a different topic. But this sword, let's stay on topic, has a washer. But you'll notice, yeah, it's really thick. It's about 5mm thick, okay? It's far, far thicker than it needs to be. Why is it so thick? Well, clearly you need something there, again, to stop this problem of the blade eating its way through the soft steel guard. Hardened steel, not hardened steel. I should also mention this is modelled on the Masiello's own practice sabre. In Italy there were various different designs of Gymnasium sabre. They vary quite a bit. Some are curved, some are straight, different types of guards. Some have a ring around them, others don't. Some have got perforations, some don't. This is Masiello's version, which the British Army copied. Not all of them have such a thick washer as this, but this one does. And you can see it's about, yeah, it's probably about maybe 6mm thick, okay? Now, my view is that the reason that that is so thick is to provide weight, okay? I believe that if you want to have a narrow blade, what you have to do is you have to keep a weapon that's still the same weight or about the same weight as a service sword, as an actual sword that you might use in combat. And just to show you what this is the practice weapon for, this is the 1895 pattern service sword, okay, which you can cut with, but it's basically a thrust-centric sword. If you want to have a practice weapon which weighs the same as that, but which doesn't hit as hard as that, because despite the fact they're not thrust-centric, they can still hit pretty hard, then you want a narrower blade up here and some weight here, so that when you hold it in the hand, you feel weight in front of your hand and it feels like a real blade, but what you're actually hitting with, and bear in mind I've got no protection on my arm here, it hurts a bit, but I'm not injuring myself. Okay, you can hit yourself, ow, fairly hard with a Gymnasium sabre of this type without doing any real injury. Now, just think about that for a second. Hold on, so you've got a blade that's narrower than the real thing and has a weight at the base. Okay, hold that thought, we'll come back to that. Okay, then we find in 1907, the British Gymnasium sabre is changed yet again, and this blade is even narrower. Okay, so here's the 1895 above and the 1907 below. They're the same length. In fact, the 1907 is slightly longer, but they're about the same length. The one above is broader and the one below is narrower. So they made the blade even narrower. But look at the washer now. There is no disputing at all. There is, maybe you could argue with me on the 1895. I don't think you could, but maybe you could try and argue with me on the 1895. But I don't think there is any way you can argue with me on the 1907. That is not just a washer, okay? That is a weight. Look at the thickness of it. It's about what, more than 1 centimetre. It's probably about 12mm. So we've got a very, very similar guard. Yeah, this one's got perforations in it, so the guard has been made lighter, but it's fundamentally the same design and shape. The grip is a different construction. This one's an aluminium grip with a internal screw nut, but fundamentally similar hilts. But look, narrower blade, heavier weight. And I believe that's for the reason that I've just been explaining, that quite simply you want to have something that you can hit someone safely with and not be injuring your army training partner, and you can hit them pretty lightly with these things. Well, you can hit them hard but without breaking bones and this kind of stuff, and wear lighter equipment, hopefully less padding or lighter fencing masks, but you still have the feeling, because the weight's here, of a blade, of a real service blade, because it still feels like you've got an actual blade in front of your hand, because the weight is placed in front of where your fingers are. Okay, but what you don't have is, you don't have the weight up here, you don't have the inertia of a real blade. If we go back to the 1895 service sword again, this feels similar in the hand. Actually, it's got a little bit more heft in front of the hand than those have, but look at the amount of mass in the last 18 inches of the blade. Okay, a hell of a lot more metal up here, which means when you actually swing this thing, it's going to have an enormous amount more momentum than those Gymnasium sabers do. So, to finish off, I would say that there's no question that at the end of the 19th century or beginning of the 20th century, this is what they were doing with Gymnasium sabers. They were making the blades lighter at the tip, so they were quicker and hit with less force, less inertia, and they were adding weight back here, so the total weight of the weapon and the general feel of the weapon was similar to the actual military service weapon, but you could hit people without injuring them too badly, or get away with wearing less stuff. And there has been some discussion in the past about whether that is why the so-called fedders or federschwerts are designed a similar way. Could it be a similar problem leads to a similar conclusion? Very narrow, flexible blade, mass here, the shield here, this being the important one. This isn't actually a particularly big shield, but as you will probably know, some of them have much, much bigger shilts here. Some people dispute this. Some people say that this is just for hand protection, or it's because the original ones were made of blunt swords where they just ground the edges off. There are lots of different theories, lots of different ideas. One of the problems when we get into medieval and Renaissance martial arts is that everyone has a different opinion and no one can ever reach a consensus or an agreement on certain things. They can on some things, but on certain things, because there's not enough evidence to ever prove anyone right or wrong, so anybody can believe whatever they like. 19th century martial arts are a little bit different. We've got more evidence, we've got more of the weapons, more of the literature. My feeling is that federschwerts probably were designed with a similar idea to these Gymnasium sabers, in that by having the weight there, it still feels like a real sword, but by removing the weight from there, it doesn't hit like a real sword. You could argue that whether that was their original intent, or maybe they had a variety of different intents, but whatever they did or thought, maybe that's why the federschwert has become the go-to longsword simulator for modern HEMA longsword. Because let's face it, these don't hit as hard as a simple blunted medieval longsword would do, okay, because they've got less inertia at the tip. So whatever they originally thought in the 15th to 17th centuries, maybe today we're using these partly, not entirely, partly because it's what they used, but partly perhaps we're using these for a similar reason to why they used these in the 19th century. I hope that's been somewhat interesting, and that thing is called a washer, but the washer has many different uses: to seal the sword in the scabbard, to protect the guard from wearing through from the blade, and perhaps in some cases to add weight to practice weapons. Cheers folks! Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers folks!